Story 1. This story happened about 15 years ago, give or take. At the time, I worked for a small industrial railroad in my city that served about 20 different industries along the docks. To get to the docks from the yard where I would pick up the inbound deliveries to the industry's cars, we had a mile of street trackage that ran right down the middle of a small street. Numerous bars lined the street on one side, with the river on the other side. Because of city regulations, we were only allowed to operate along that span of track between specific hours. Typically, it was from 11 at night to about 5 in the morning. However, since the bars were open at that time, it also meant that we had to trundle along at a crawl, usually walking pace or just about that, and keep the locomotive on the front end of the movement. Every night I went down that street, there would typically be 2 or 3 people who had parked too close to the tracks, prompting me to have to get people to move their cars. It wasn't a major problem, just an annoyance. Except for one guy. It seemed that every single night, I would have to stop about halfway down because this guy would always park his truck at an angle in the street, as opposed to parallel parking. There were some angle parking spaces, but they were further down where there weren't rails in the road. Every single night, I'd have to head into the bar this guy owned and bug him to get him to move the truck. Most of the time, it'd take him a good 30 minutes to an hour to drag himself out and move the thing. This meant, of course, I was losing time that I needed to get my job done. After months of this, I finally decided that I had enough. So, I decided to have the guy towed. Yeah, that didn't work out as well as I hoped. It turned out that the guy also had some job with the city, or the mayor's office, or some friend in either. So, no one would dare come out and tow his truck. I think I waited there a good hour before he eventually came out and moved it, even having the gall to flip me off as he left. At that point, I decided that not only was I totally done with the guy, but if the chance arose, I was going to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Nothing physical per se, just a hard-learned lesson. A couple of days later, I found myself heading down the track with half a dozen heavy cars with machinery bound for the docks. As I rounded the curve and neared the place where that guy always parked, I gently applied the independent brakes on the locomotive. This would slow the heavy train, but wasn't enough to stop it outright. At least, not quickly. I waited until the very last minute, laying on the horn and applying the full brakes, bringing everything to a screeching halt in the middle of the street. As I felt the brakes begin to hold, there was this loud thunk and screeching and tearing of metal as the train simply punted the truck out of the way, tearing the bed clean off it in the process. This did not go unnoticed, as a crowd had started to gather out front of the bar when they heard the train coming. I stayed in the cab, calling back to dispatch and informing them that I'd struck a parked car, and they needed to get the police and a tow truck out to my location. All the while, I could hear this guy screaming heard him over the sound of the locomotive no less at the top of his lungs about how he was going to have me thrown in jail, sue the company, and all manner of things. Locking the doors, I opted to just wait in the cab for the police to arrive. Eventually, they arrived and started taking statements. I explained the problem, noting that I could have, but it wouldn't have been a good idea simply slam on the brakes due to the cargo I was carrying, and that the only reason I hit the truck was because it was improperly parked. I added that the gentleman had been warned in the past that something like this could happen and had ignored the warnings. The man, for his part, was simply livid, hopping around, yelling at me, yelling at the cops, and just beside himself. In the end, he was ticketed for his bad parking, obstructing the passage of a train, and his truck was totaled, and he ended up on the hook for paying for it. The truck was brand new, and not yet paid off, or so I was told. It took about 2 hours to clean up the mess, and I was per company rules suspended for a week during the company investigation. But honestly, it was worth it. I didn't have any problems with him from that point forward either. Story 2. So this happened a long time ago. It was November 2009, and I was listening to I Got a Feeling by the Black Eyed Peas, looking for a cheap apartment. I found a great ad on Craigslist and arranged for a viewing. I met the landlady, a portly woman with a Betty Page haircut. I wasn't here for the company, however, but for the cheap room. It's not great looking, but it is cheap, so I told her I was interested. She told me the place was mine if I could get a deposit by the end of the day. Sweet. I went to the bank and grabbed the $450 needed, half a month's rent. She and I cross-signed a standard lease, and I asked when I could get a key to move in, and she said a couple of days as the current tenant had yet to collect all of their stuff. So, I was sleeping on the couch at a buddy's place for now, And so I just chilled, seeing sights, enjoying the first few weeks in a new city. A couple of days rolled by, and I hadn't heard from the landlady, so I got frustrated and left a few stern voicemails, but alas, I was ghosted. Finally, she left me a voicemail and said she was sorry, but she could not rent the place to me. I started to get angry, but I am a pretty cool customer, so I did the research, found out my rights in an unfamiliar new municipality, and discovered that if someone backs out of a lease without a legal reason, the other party is entitled to double the deposit they placed. So I figured she owed me about $900. I left more messages and emails. Again with the ghosting, not answering the phone, no responses via email either. I got fed up. Now, I had just accepted a new job, but it didn't start until the turn of the month. I would guess it was about the third week of November 2009. I had some spare time, so I hopped on the bus, bought a magazine, and sat at the bus stop across from the rental house, and just waited. For a couple of hours I waited, but man was it worth it. I saw her showing the unit to another potential renter. I held my cool and waited for her to finish with her newest renter, and made my way over to the house to confront her. As soon as she saw me, she started to wail about how the tenant changed their mind, blah blah blah, and that's why she couldn't rent to me. I'd heard enough. I squared my stance directly opposite this clearly upset woman. Now you listen to me. You will get me $900 as required by law by the end of the day, or I will go directly to the police station and let them deal with you. She turned white. For a minute, I thought she was going to puke on the ground right there in front of me. She said, "Hold on, I will get you your money." I remember thinking, wow, that was easier than I thought. She went upstairs. The unit was a basement unit in the house she was living in, and I kid you not, handed me a wad of cash and said, "Here, this is ruining my Christmas, but here." She almost pushed me off balance as she jammed the messy wad of cash into my hands. "Thank you. Good day," I said, took the money, counted it, and walked away. I didn't turn around and look back. I got on the first bus that stopped nearby, heading back toward the direction of my friend's house. Not until I was home did I calm down and realize it was going to be a sweet Christmas, all thanks to a lying, phony cheapskate. However, this is not the end of the revenge. About a week later, I got a phone call from a friend asking me if the lady in the news is the same crazy lady I got the double damage deposit from. I'm like, what? Sure enough, it turns out this lady was running the same scam in parallel with a bunch of other victims. I am mortified, not just because I almost got scammed, but it immediately occurred to me that the money I got was someone else's money, and they were homeless for the holidays. I headed right down to the police station, where there was, I kid you not, a line of crying people filing reports about being scammed by this woman. I felt awful, and when it was my turn, I got to the intake officer and started to give my story. I laid it all down, how I fell for it, how I left a snotty voicemail, how I staked out the rental to confront her, my demand of double the money back, my threats of legal action against her, and finally the skillful execution of the law by getting double the deposit back. I told the cop I took some of the money that belonged to the other victims, and she looked at me and said, "Man, you were the only one smart enough to confront her in a reasonable way. You earned that money. Don't worry about it." A young lady who was now homeless and desperate couldn't help but overhear, and as I was leaving the police station, she approached me and said, "Hey, did you get your money back from that woman?" To which I sheepishly replied, "Actually, I got double my deposit from her when I threatened her with the police." The girl blinked a couple of times and finally grinned, started a slow clap, and announced to the other victims still waiting to give a statement in the lobby of the police station, "This guy took her for double the damage deposit." I cringed. But then, in the most unexpected turn of events, the line of victims began applauding. I suppose with the realization that while their money was gone, someone had really messed with her back, and that made them happy. They cheered. I felt better. The cops laughed. And we all, there had to be 20 people in all, had a joyful cosmic moment of holiday schadenfreude at her expense. I left the police station with a clean conscience and a smile on my face and enjoyed every last penny of that worthless woman's nasty stack. Story 3. This happened a few years ago, right after I graduated college. I would make an 8-hour drive home a few times a year to see family, usually over the holidays. During these trips, there was only wilderness, fields, mountains, and tiny towns along the way. During one of these trips, I stopped at a gas station to get some food, and I apparently lost my debit card or it was stolen. It was a card I never used and looked identical to my main one, so I didn't notice it was missing until later when I got a call from my bank and saw my account was overdrawn. Being fresh out of college, making $12 an hour, the $400 was a huge deal. I worked at a credit card processor at the time, so I had a very unusual familiarity with how credit card transactions worked. This was a debit card, but ran as credit. I could have done a chargeback, of course, but I knew that merchants were fined $15 for each chargeback on top of the return and got a ding on their record with Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. If they had too many chargebacks, they would have their processing revoked and incur heavy fines. Merchants are usually mom and pop shops and are usually innocent in the matter, so I decided to give them a call. Also, the charges all came from the same gas station that I lost it at. So I suspected it was an employee who stole my card and was stupid enough to use it at work. I wanted to let the manager owners know so they could keep an eye out for unscrupulous employees. Employee theft is unfortunately common and is not brought to light until a customer brings it up. I thought I would just give them a call and ask for the refund. Easy. I called, and a woman answered. I asked to speak with the manager, and she said she was the manager. I explained that I had lost my card at that location, and someone had later used my card there. I said I didn't want to accuse anyone, but I think one of her employees had the card and she may want to investigate. I also said I'd like a return for all the purchases to save them the hassle of a chargeback. When I usually work with managers in this situation, they're very willing to help and take employee theft very seriously. Instead, I was met with hostility and insults. She told me I probably deserved it for losing my card in the first place and not noticing and deserved this lesson. She interrupted me and told me to basically get lost and none of her employees would steal. Getting a bad feeling, I asked for the number of the owner. She said there was no owner. What? By now I was shaking in anger, so I told her I was calling the police and hung up. She tried to call back, and I didn't answer. By now I was angry, crying. I had a feeling I knew who did it, but now I needed to prove it. I had no intention of calling the cops because what cops care about some petty credit card theft? It's incredibly hard to prove and most cops have serious crimes to worry about. Lucky for me, this is in the middle of nowhere, population 100 or something. First, I called my bank and asked if they had the record of the exact times the card was used. They gave me the times down to the minute. I then called the police and got a very friendly woman. It seems she's not busy and actually listened to my story, including the hostile manager. I asked if she was able to go look at the surveillance tapes or something. She said the store was 5 minutes away and she would stop by. I guess she felt sorry for me or was bored, but I'll take it. She said she'd give me a call if she found anything. I eagerly awaited her call, but was not expecting much. A couple of days went by and I got a call from the nice officer. She said that she went by the store and reviewed the footage. At the exact time I told her, the cameras caught the hostile manager making the purchases and signing receipts for the exact same amounts with a card that looked exactly like mine. Even better, they were going to charge her with felony identity theft since making purchases on someone's card without permission is identity theft on top of monetary theft, at least in my state. They asked if I wanted any restitution, but my bank had refunded me the stolen money, so I declined. I was absolutely not expecting a cop to go out of their way to help me, and I was definitely not expecting it to result in an arrest. I felt a sense of pride for actually sticking up for myself and not just taking the money from my bank and letting the thief go. I'm a pretty small and non-confrontational person, but that day I felt really strong. If she'd been nice and worked with me or even just apologized and done the returns, I would not have called the cops. Because she was so rude and unhelpful, she got a felony instead.